Philip was from Bethsaida, and he is the one who brought in Nathanael, who was from the same part of Galilee. You may remember the story. We have found the one of whom Moses and the prophets spoke, Jesus of Nazareth. From Nazareth? Can any good thing come from Nazareth? Probably the very words, because that sounds a bit too real not to be true. What in France is referred to as the guerre de clocher, belfry warfare, that is between one belfry and another. And so, to a large extent, the immediate circle of the Lord were these common people from Galilee. We notice that 4 were involved with fishing, which is symbolic with regard to the future. They were also cousins, brothers, and the like. James is referred to as the brother of the Lord, which would mean belonging to the same family as the Lord, therefore a cousin. And he, according to tradition, was martyred in 62 AD, stoned and then clubbed to death. He was the author of the epistle that bears his name. He writes in a very simple, direct, pithy, Jewish way, which would correspond to his reality. He was the first bishop of Jerusalem, and the hymn the Church uses at vigils on this day refers to this link that he has with Sion. You may be aware that the first Christian community, Jewish-based, in its Jewish ethos, could but be fairly short-lived. An ancient tradition says that they were warned by prophecy from within to flee. They went to the other side of the Jordan to Pera, and there the Christian community was able to avoid the disaster of the collapse of Jerusalem in 70 AD. We see, however, how the system is trying to maintain itself. In the Acts of the Apostles, we see how surprises happen, which should be enough to make the authorities, as we would say, cop on. There's one famous case when they imprison a couple of the apostles, major ones, and they have a guard and everything, making sure that there's no way they could ever escape. And an angel of the Lord sets them free, and they go and carry on their business as though nothing had happened, preaching in the temple itself. And they were going to interrogate them further, and they went to look for them in the prison, and past the guards who were happily guarding an empty prison, an empty cell. So even they hadn't realized that they weren't in there. And they had to, at that point, do so discreetly, bring them discreetly for interrogation, because they were afraid of being stoned, it says. And then all they can do is warn them not to preach again in this name. And we have that answer of Peter. It befits us, oportet in Latin, to obey God rather than men. So they let them go. But any person in his right mind would have realized at that point that they were starting, as the Lord himself said to Paul, or Saul as he was on the ground at that point, it is hard for thee to kick against the pricks, to kick against the goads, that they are actually fighting against God. Remember how Gamaliel gave to his peers, actually, this advice to desist from attacking this, leave it to see whether it will work or not, because otherwise they might find themselves fighting against God. If it's not from God, it'll collapse anyway. That, by the way, is good advice. But still, they won't listen, and they are actually fighting against God. And in fact, the Lord declared such when he was appearing to Saul on the ground. Why are you persecuting me? To make a little jump to our time, it's strange, actually, that those who were really brought up, baptized and confirmed Catholics in this country don't seem to realize against who they are fighting when they use all the means that they have, the media and the political system, to fight against God. And so there is eventually this jump. The Hebrew bloc is able to carry on, but after a while there is a great change in emphasis and orientation. One hint of it is actually already in the Gospel, and it might just pass us by unnoticed. But Philip enters into it. You may notice that all the names of the apostles are Semitic except two. Philip is one of them. Philippos is lover of horses, it's Greek. The other is Andreas, a courageous man. The root is courage, Andrew. And at a certain point there is this hidden episode where some Greeks, notice Greeks, therefore non-Jews, come up and look for someone that they can use to have access to the great man. It's what we do when we want to have access to somebody. We find someone who has access. So they find a couple of apostles, but they seek out those who might be more sympathetic to their cause, the very two who have a Greek name, Philip and Andrew. And they want to see the Lord. And so they bring the Lord to them, and we have a discourse which actually is quite sublime. But what I want to zoom into is the fact that this was picked up by the Greeks. To this day, the Greek Church looks at that passage as a hint of what is to be. What happens? The whole of the Old Testament is written in the sacred language, which of course at the Bar Mitzvah, the Jew, the young adult Jew, at 12, 13, the adolescent growing into manhood, undertook and assumed all the rights and privileges and duties of the male Hebrew. And he had to be able to read, and that's still the case to this day, the reading in Hebrew. And there's a whole rite in which he has to hold this pointer lest the sweat of his fingers ruin the page. And traditionally they're hand-copied, these Hebrew characters. And they're held in great respect, even physically, held in a kind of tabernacle affair. So it would have been thought by those coming from the first Jewish experience of the Lord, in which he was inserted himself, the Hebrew Christians, that would presumably carry on. It was so sacred, the Hebrew language. It was not the language of daily parlance. They spoke Aramaic. Aram is Syria. But they use the same characters in both language, and they are both Semitic languages close to each other. However, and the Greeks picked this up, there was going to be a complete shift, and whereas the Old Testament is in Hebrew, except for a few passages, 2 or 3 in Aramaic, Daniel and so on, a few parts of those in Aramaic, all the New Testament is in Greek, with Semitic language coming through in Greek quite often. The closer it is to the Gospel, that's the case, Matthew for instance. And also a few ipsissima verba, the very words spoken by the Lord coming through, even in the Greek, coming via the Greek, but they're actually the Hebrew, Aramaic coming through. So, what's happening? We see that in the spread of the Gospel, it's not going to be in any way associated anymore with one part of the world, but it's going to be universalized by the immediate use, acceptance and diffusion of what is going to be actually a sacred language, the Greek of the New Testament, which becomes then also the language of prayer of the early church. And we must never forget that. Massively, Greek is the language of the early church. The letters that we have, a lot of them are in Greek, and we had actually a great thrill. A few friends, we got together to translate them into modern English some years ago when I was in Wales with the Focolari movement with New City Press. And when we were starting the enterprise, we were told the boys that were at this before us were Newman and Company. And it had the same effect on us. Wow, there's power in this. You saw the centuries on the page, and they certainly gave you the faith and the awareness of where you were coming from. And we can see why it had that effect on Newman. And so this happened until the last of the concentric circles was realized, because at the ascension the Lord said, "You will be my witnesses," and he gave concentric circles in Jerusalem, Samaria, Judea, and to the uttermost parts of the world. And that is what happens in the Acts of the Apostles. And so the intermediary stage is going to be the Greek. It gets, if you remember, only towards the end of the Acts to Rome, and deliberately it is left in suspense. There's a hint that Paul is actually free to talk openly there in Rome. They leave him be in his own rented accommodation, and therefore it's important. Why? Although it's not mentioned, Rome is going to be then the point of transition. Why? Because whereas in the whole of the Mediterranean basin, up until that part, Greek is the channel, and it's, by the way, providential, because it's the English, as it were, of the time, like Americanese. From there, Rome, although much Greek was spoken in Rome because of the slaves, it's actually going to be Latin for huge chunks with Roman culture. Carthage, it's a big one. You have great authors coming from there writing very good Latin. Tertullian, Cyprian, they give us a language, a vocabulary which has remained. The whole of the North African church, Augustine is a great figure, the whole library and theology given to the church, the great brain of the West. And of course, it goes further. Why? Rome conquers, and has conquered. And so the influence comes with it, and their lingua franca is Latin. It's going to supersede the local languages in the Latin countries, France, Spain, Portugal, actually even Romania. Strangely enough, because the Romanian language is based on Latin, the Dacia of the Latins. And, of course, when it comes to us, what happens? Well, we have the Celtic language there, which we still speak in Wales and Ireland, different forms of it, and in Scotland, and in Breton it's coming from Wales and Cornwall. But there, what happens is this. If you look at the manuscripts, and we have them, the actual liturgical language is Latin, which means that they're going to be using also the Roman canon, which is the one common unifying factor throughout the whole Western bloc. And the Pope of Rome is actually technically the Patriarch of the West. Of course he is Peter, and therefore he has to be there, and he's the central block and pillar. But the other patriarchates were there before him, notably that of James, of which we spoke, Jerusalem, and it's in his successor's hands that the miracle happens every year of the Holy Light, igniting from heaven in the Holy Sepulchre. And then Antioch, because Peter was first of all Bishop of Antioch, where the Christians precisely now were becoming Greek, and there they made him obviously the head. And then only the third time, Rome. But he has to be there. But this then is our history. Philip, it would seem, preached in Phrygia, and was martyred there, quite cruelly. Crucified, it would seem. This then is our faith, and I just want to conclude on one point. It's to be borne in mind that we belong to this serene, providential transmission, which is not based on the spectacular, although God himself can do it and does it, as we have in the Gospel today. The works that they will do will be greater than what he did, because he will be working through them. And that's the case in missionary development. But because the work of God normally is done in depth, and that's where we get it wrong. The best preaching, the best publicity that the Church has been able to offer and can offer still is a place of encounter. I mean a liturgy in which God himself does the work. And we think in our time that we can do it better by inventing the spectacular, even in that sphere. It's completely wrong. I've heard quite a few testimonies over the years of people who have been profoundly moved and changed by an unexpected exposure to God head-on in a moving liturgy. And that is not only actually in the sphere of the Tridentine and the liturgical sphere of the East, very solemn, but also very beautiful worship in modern terms. Because when I was in France, I came across extremely beautiful worship in the ambit of the new communities that were born in France. There's a lot going on there. Why? It's serene. It's based on genuine beauty and not on the happy-clappy. One is deep, the other is immediate and fairly shallow as a rule, and therefore the effects are correspondingly deep or shallow. I conclude, what has worked still works and always will work, because God is out of time and mysterious, and we cannot encapsulate him or in any way tell him how to do what he should do. It's our business to suggest him and to give him a throne, tentatively, and as it were, like Moses before the burning bush, taking off our sandals and being silently before the great unchanging